I'm going to skip ahead. Let's go to Gnosticism. Well, let me do Docetism. I got to touch some heresies. Here's another pesky heresy. It claims that Jesus never had an earthly body, and that what people saw was a phantom. The Council of Nicaea is going to reject that one as well. But Justin's defense affirms that Jesus was a person born in the line of David because he was born of Mary. So Jesus was conceived of Mary, he came from her, and this conception was virginal and pertains to the most hidden mysteries in the silence of God. Now, again, in the dialogue with Trypho, Justin denied, who died in, I guess, around 167, insists that the reality of the human nature of Jesus, and as a consequence of that human nature, also insists on the maternity of Mary over Jesus. Like Ignatius, he emphasizes the virginal conception and bases his, his understanding on the parallelism between Eve and Mary and that passage in Genesis. Irenaeus, who dies around 202, focuses on the reality of the human corporality of Jesus, that he really came from the womb of Mary to combat the prevailing discontent of his time. And he also bases on the divine motherhood his own Christology, and that's the human nature assumed by the Son of God in the womb of Mary that gives redemptive value of the death of Jesus, also its universality and its applicability to all human beings. So obviously we've even got a understanding that maybe Jesus wasn't even real, he was a ghost, okay? But Docetism is contradicted by many of the scriptures themselves, but nevertheless that was one of the heresies that influenced the nature of who Jesus was and where he came from. But the one that's going to produce more problems than that is Gnosticism. It's a word comes from the Greek word gnosis, meaning knowledge, and in its religious context it means a mystical knowledge of God or a deity, and as such a philosophical construct. It actually predates Christianity, but its influences were so prevalent that it is actually drug into the church. It was perhaps the most dangerous heresy that threatened the early church in its first 300 years. And it was influenced by people or thinkers like Plato especially, because it's based on two false premises. First, it espouses a dualism regarding spirit and matter. Gnostics assert that matter is inherently evil and spirit is always good. And as a result of this presupposition, Gnostics believe anything done in the body, even the grossest sin, has no meaning because real life exists in the spirit realm only. Gnostics they assert that they have an elevated knowledge of a higher truth that's only known to a certain few people. They see themselves essentially as a privileged class that's elevated above everybody else by their higher and deeper knowledge of God. They believe that Jesus' physical body was not real, but only seemed to be physical, and that his spirit descended upon him at his baptism, but left him just before his crucifixion. Now, views like that destroy not only the true humanity of Jesus, but also the atonement. For Jesus must not only have been truly God, but also truly man. And it was in the 4th century that we find this term, epiphanos, which means ever virgin. And it's introduced by St. Epiphanius, and it's actually in his Confession of Faith. And later on in the Council of Constantinople, it's proclaimed as a dogma of the church. So perpetual virginity, or the subject of the virginity of Mary, is established very, very early. And but it's also important to note that this council comes after the closing of the New Testament canon, not before. So with the affirmation of the perpetual virginity of Mary becoming more and more widespread and universal, another privilege, the absolute holiness of the Virgin, was also given emphasis. She was viewed as a woman who possessed a special grace from God, which predisposed her to choose not to sin, although it was not taught that Mary was ever constitutionally incapable of sin, as I'd mentioned before. But there was a lot of debate on the topic, with the possibility that Mary had many imperfections considered at first. Irenaeus, Tertullian, Origen, Basil, John Chrysostom, Ephraim, Cyril, they all held this belief, and only Ambrose and Augustine did not accept it. But the thinking of these two is actually going to win the day. After the dogmatic proclamation on the divine maternity of Mary in Ephesus in 431, the consideration of the privilege of absolute holiness of Mary is going to grow stronger, and it's going to be disseminated both in the East and the West. Most holy will be what's referred to in the West, in the Latin Church, and Panagia in the Greek Eastern Church. And since the 4th century, together with the privilege already mentioned, ever virgin and most holy, all the other affirmations start to flow. And following on these is the idea of how Mary died. Dormition or assumption being the two words most commonly used, as well as her preservation from all sin, including original sin, and then her task as mediatrix and her queenship. These are all developed. And along these lines are other saints that you've loved and known all your lives, like Saint Modest of Jerusalem, St. Andrew of Crete, St. German of Constantinople, St. John Damascene, all of them very familiar, I'm sure, and the fathers of the last century of the patristic period, all of whom studied in depth these privileges. And they demand our attention, which to your everlasting relief we're not going to consider tonight. But just to say that there was never any absolute agreement of any of this among the earliest theologians or among the Eastern churches. So let's consider the earliest ideas of the nature of the conception of Mary. Now, as you know, the Immaculate Conception is the belief that the Virgin Mary was free from original sin from the moment of her conception. It is one of the 4 Marian dogmas of the Catholic Church. Now, you know the difference between a dogma and a doctrine, right? Okay. They're not interchangeable. A doctrine is simply the teaching. Okay? A dogma is what is taught. Okay? So you can have teachings on all kinds of things, but not all doctrines are dogmas. But all dogmas are doctrines. Does that make sense? Okay. I thought that would be helpful. So we have, the Immaculate Conception is one of the 4 Marian dogmas of the Catholic Church. But it was not defined as a dogma until 1854, when Pope Pius IX issued his bull, Ineffabilis Deus. And by the way, those 4 dogmas are the Immaculate Conception, Mary as the Mother of God, Mary's perpetual virginity, and the Assumption of Mary into heaven. Now, a lot of Catholics still confuse the Immaculate Conception with the virgin birth of Jesus. So what does Immaculate Conception mean? In the first instance of her conception, Mary was exempted from the stain of original sin, and sanctifying grace was given to her before sin could take effect in her soul. And this was redemption from conception. As the new Eve was to be the mother of the new Adam, she was by eternal counsel of God and the merits of Christ withdrawn from the general law of original sin. And our clue from the Bible is actually startlingly clear from the message of the archangel, who I mentioned earlier, said, "Hail, full of grace." But this is not so much a proof as it is an illustration, because there's no scriptural mention of this dogma. But it's implicitly found in the fathers of the church. It's found in more general terms about Mary. with terms like holy, innocent, most pure, intact, immaculate, all of these by Irenaeus of Lyon in the year 150, okay? And even in a very explicit language from Augustine of Hippo, when he says Mary free from original sin, he actually states that. Anselm of Normandy, who comes really late, he's already into the 10th century. And the patristic writings on this subject are extensive. They're really far too extensive for us to do any justice. In fact, I had no idea how they extensive were until I started to get into them. I can't tell you how much I did not know about Mary until May of this year. And that's why I chose to do this segment, because I knew the essentials, like any priest would know, but I'd never done a deep dive. And it's when I started getting into my dad gave me years ago all the church fathers. It takes up like almost 2.5 shelves of books. And I started going through it and I go, that's a lot. Well, that's a whole lot. Well, this is a lot more than I ever thought it could be. And it just is endless. So just to say, I'm not doing any of this any justice. I don't have it. All right. You're going to stare at Mary until it disappears. By the way, the Greek fathers never formally or explicitly addressed the question of the Immaculate Conception, which is why there is no set dogma in the Eastern Church. But it's very clear that they had an understanding. And it's not an invention of the 19th century church, as some would assert. Then we get to the Assumption, which is the belief that Mary died, her body and soul was assumed into heaven instead of going through the natural process associated with death. Now, much like the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, this dogma was not set in stone until 1950, when Pope Pius XII confirmed this belief about the Virgin Mary as the perennial teaching of the Church, when he defined it as a dogma in 1950, invoking papal infallibility to proclaim that the Immaculate Mother of God, the Ever Virgin Mary, having completed the course of her earthly life, was assumed body and soul into heavenly glory. The Constitution also cites testimonies from the early church fathers on the subject and described the history of the theological reflection on these many biblical passages, which are seen as indicating that Mary was assumed into heaven following her death. So this is Mary the apotheosis. Now, it's not explicitly recorded anywhere in Scripture. The tradition identifies her with the woman clothed with the sun, who's described in the 12th chapter of the book of Revelation. That passage calls the woman's appearance a great sign, which appeared in heaven, indicating that she's the mother of the Jewish Messiah. She has the moon under her feet and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And the Catholic iconography of the Western tradition often depicts Mary's assumption into heaven in this manner, often with some sort of pose. Who knows what it was. But the Eastern Christians have never been very happy with that, and they've always held her assumption as an essential component of their faith, but they choose the word dormition, which just means falling asleep. And as to the earliest teachings, Pius XII cited very early Byzantine liturgical texts, which by the way come from the East, as well as 8th century Arab Christian theologians like John of Damascus, in the definition of the Assumption. John of Damascus wrote a sermon on the Assumption, that she who had kept her virginity intact in childbirth should keep her own body free from all corruption even after death, and that she who carried the Creator as a child at her breast should dwell in the divine tabernacles. Now, archaeology has revealed 2 tombs of Mary, one in Jerusalem and one in Ephesus. Now, the fact that Mary lived in both places explains 2 tombs. But what is inexplicable, apart from the assumption, is the fact that there was no body in either tomb. Now, just because you discover a tomb doesn't mean that she died. How many of you already have a headstone and a grave somewhere? Of course. Just because you have a place where you'll be finally disposed doesn't mean that you're ever going to be there, right? Who knows? God may snatch you right up to heaven too. So no doubt somebody, honored Mary with a tomb, but she never took advantage of it. And there are no relics. And trust me, the early church would have made hay with relics of Mary. Anyone who peruses early church history knows that Christian belief in the communion of the saints and the sanctity of the body, in radical contrast to the Gnostic disdain for the flesh, led the early Christians to seek out relics from the bodies of the saints. Cities, religious orders, they're going to fight over bones of saints. The one that gets the most bones wins, because you get the most tourism. And this is the reason why we have relics of the apostles and so many of the greatest saints and martyrs in history. Yet never was there a relic of Mary's body. And as revered as Mary was, this would be very strange except for the fact of the Assumption. Now, the question is asked, why didn't the church fathers write on this dogma? Now, there's a lot of speculation about that. Some would say it was assumed. Ha ha ha, so to speak. Not necessarily controversial, and therefore not worth wasting ink. Everybody knew it. There might have been people went, there she goes. Evidently, there was disagreement in the circulating stories of the Assumption of Mary as to whether she was taken up alive or having died, but whether or not she was assumed was not in question. In fact, the church, even to this day, has not decided definitively the matter of whether Mary died or not. Though at the level of ordinary magisterium, it does teach that Mary died, which is in the wording used in Pius XII's document. Now, there were groups who taught that Mary never died, like St. Epiphanius. See, you remember him from earlier. In the Panarion, in which he condemns the Collyridian heresy, you remember that one, of course. I'm not even going to go into that one. He makes a point-blank statement. Like the bodies of the saints, however, she has been held in honor for her character and understanding. And if I should say anything more in her praise, she is like Elijah, who was virgin from his mother's womb, always remained so, and was taken up, but has not seen death. So Epiphanius clearly indicates his personal agreement with the idea that Mary was assumed into heaven without ever having died. And I had an Episcopal priest explain that to me. He said, well, what boy wouldn't do that for his mother? He's also going to clarify the fact that he's not certain, and no one is at least, or not definitively so, about whether or not she died. But he never says the same about the Assumption itself. That never seemed to be in doubt. So since the time of the promulgation of the dogma of the Assumption of Mary, there has been many new discoveries. We now have written evidence of belief in the Assumption of Mary as far back as the 3rd century. Now, it's not necessary for there to be written evidence all the way back to those centuries, because for us as Catholics, we have sacred tradition and sacred scripture as it is interpreted by the magisterium of the church. And first and foremost, that has given us the truth of the matter. And I believe it's really exciting that there are these new historical discoveries that continue to be made. And once again, and again, and again, they're all going to confirm the faith of our fathers. Now, next week, we're going to begin our look at how Mary appears frequently in the Middle Ages, leading us up to those most important apparitions, which is what you've all been waiting for. God bless you and thank you, and I will see y'all next week. Thank you.